Becca De Souza. Welcome
I will.
to the Spiritual Misfits Podcast.
Thank you. Very honored
Oh,
to be included as a misfit.
so good. You are, I could say this of almost everyone I chat to on this podcast, but I feel like even though we haven't met, I have great admiration for you. What I have read, the words that you have written, your story, basically Caro, who's on an earlier episode, which a lot of people really resonated with. Caro hit me up and she's like, you should have a chat with my friend Becca. She sent some of your pieces of writing with that, and I'll put those in the show notes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
If you're happy for me
That's
to.
fine. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
No,
So
I'm a big fan of Caro. She's amazing.
So good. How do you like to introduce yourself? What is the snapshot into the life of Becca De Souza?
So I live as a visitor on Darawal country, which is also known as Wollongong. I do really want to acknowledge that I'm speaking on unceded land, stolen land, and really want to honor the resilience of Wadi Wadi people, Darawal people who have survived in the face of genocide and colonization, and absolutely pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So grateful actually to have to be living here for the past 14 or so years. I'm originally from Turtle Island, which is the kind of decolonized name for North America. I'm Shawnee through my mom's lineage, which is a First Nations people group that is originally from the Ohio River Valley. And my mom grew up in Ohio. And I'm married to Chris, who is a very lovely human. And we have 3 school-age children together. And yeah, that's me. I do work in pregnancy support, and my goal is really to get quality birth education and support to women who otherwise have barriers, financially, culturally, language barriers, whatever the barrier is, to find a way to, get the support to them that they deserve. And
important
that's
work.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And if people are listening, and if anyone's listening and they're like, Becca's voice sounds like vaguely familiar, you were part of the chorus of voices.
I was.
On our Advent liturgy episode.
And I was using a First Nations version, which I reckon is very beautiful. You should definitely get your hands on the First Nations version of the New Testament, which is pretty recently put out. But that was really fun. That was fun.
Well, it was beautiful translation and beautifully read by you. And that's just a little Easter egg of insider knowledge for those podcast fans who are
recognized.
Something's going on here. So, Becca, how have you ever felt like a spiritual misfit? And what's some of the backstory for you in terms of faith, spirituality, Christianity? Share some of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I was born and raised in American evangelicalism, which I think looked different in the early 80s when I was born. But, the seeds of what's happening now in America were fully planted at that point. I grew up, my dad's a pastor, American Baptist. So they split from the Southern Baptists over slavery. And so, American Baptists tend to be more progressive than Southern Baptists. Apparently we like to also say that. That's how so I grew up, my dad's a pastor. But we definitely had the American flag and the cross together behind the podium. That was very normal for me. I'm the oldest of 5 children. I'm an Enneagram 2, for those that are familiar, probably leaning very heavily into a 1 wing at that point in my life. I'm more 3 wing now. So really want to be loved, really want to be good. That was a big goal. I was decently patriotic growing up. I actually voted for George W. Bush in 2000. I was 18. And I ended up going to a Christian university that was a few hours from home. And I wanted to study ministry and theology and Bible. And I actually didn't realize until after I got there that this university was it's called Messiah College then, now Messiah University, was rooted in most of my professors were teaching out of the Peace Church tradition. So Anabaptist, a lot of Mennonite professors in the Bible department. And so that was completely new for me, learning, just hearing words. It's like, what part of your Bible is being highlighted? And it was like a different set of highlighters were used, talking about justice and the poor. And there was no American flags on campus. Learning that there were some Christians committed to nonviolence. That was completely new for me at 18. And I really loved it. I did a service learning class and in my second semester, and we read a book called Reading the Bible Through Third World Eyes, which I don't know that title necessarily holds up anymore, but it was really even reading scripture from the underside, from people who have been oppressed by empires rather than the people who normally I hear speak, who are the people benefiting from empire. And so I would say that all became confusing for me. I would say that's when I kind of started to ask questions, started to feel concerned. I can remember actually in that class, I remember adamantly arguing that if somebody had a flat tire on the side of the road and you pulled over and you helped them get their car back going again, and you didn't share the gospel with them and they went to hell when they died, that you would have basically done nothing, nothing, because the only thing that mattered was where your soul was. So that's where I was, early 2001. And I spent the summer teaching English, living in a community near Detroit, Michigan, that's highly Arabic speaking, highly refugee background, a lot of Yemeni women, Lebanese women at that point, and Iraqi women. And I just absolutely loved it. And then I think I started to really, as soon as you become friends with people that you had been told something about your whole life, that will, you have to start questioning something, you start questioning the narrative. And then September 11th, 2001 happened, the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and then in Washington, D.C. And that's when patriotism and Christian nationalism in America, I feel like, really came to the forefront. And I remember being very worried for my Muslim friends in Detroit, hearing about the backlash that was happening at that point. January 2002, so this is just a few months later, I actually had been accepted to study in the Middle East. So I spent about 4 months in Cairo and in a few different countries in the area. And I realized I had been told lies about Muslims, about people in the Middle East, how they felt about Americans. I was told they would hate me, they'd hate my freedom. That was really the narrative. And actually they offered so much love and hospitality. Like, honestly, in Cairo, if you're lost and you ask somebody for directions, they will literally stop what they're doing and take you there. It's just amazing. And studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by listening to Palestinians and as well as Israelis. And so that was just a different way of learning, actually learning about Islam, because you're actually going to a mosque and you're learning about Islam from Muslim professors. It's not how America really trains you to learn, in my experience. And
I've always thought, the level of expertise that some Christians think they have about other religions is just, when you actually think, oh, wait a sec, you're just commentating from outside and you've never gone in and actually clarified, asked, sought to understand. Yeah. It's pretty two-dimensional.
But you have to do that, actually. Otherwise, you'll start asking so many questions. And otherwise, you'll realize that you're wrong. And you'll realize that, for instance, most Muslims, as well as plenty of Christians, not all, but are busy trying to love God and love their neighbor, just like, Christians hope that we are as well, And so there's a reason people keep that distance, because it changes you. when you become friends with people. It really does.
I tend to think of love and fear as like directions on a spectrum.
Yeah.
And love eliminates distance and moves towards, and fear creates distance and moves away from.
Yeah.
And with that bigger distance, it's much easier to feel afraid.
Yeah.
But when you're up close, when you see somebody and they break those stereotypes you got in your mind, it's a lot harder to continue to hate when you're up in that close, vulnerable space.
Yeah. And you'll actually then begin to fear the people on your side that have been telling you things, that's where, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think when I was studying the Middle East, I started to really question hell as eternal conscious torment. That was something I just couldn't imagine God letting or causing, these amazing people to be tortured eternally. And also, I mean, just because we're coming, this week is 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But at that point in 2003, I was very involved in attending protests and also organizing protests on our campus, attending protests in D.C. And I think seeing Christians support that war was so devastating and very, what I think a lot of American Christians went through in 2015, 2016, when Donald Trump was coming to power. That happened for me in 2002, 2003. Just like, no, I can't, this is not the Jesus that I now know. I don't know who your God is. I'm not recognizing. I don't feel like we are. If anybody's not worshiping the same God, it felt like me and the Christians that wanted to bomb Iraq. And I remember, I wanted to mention this. I had a professor, Gordon Brubaker, say to me, he said, Becca, I think I was just in his office talking to him, wrestling with this stuff. And he said, Becca, Jesus did not die to be your personal Lord and Savior. Jesus died so that the U.S. would not drop bombs on Iraq. And that has shaped me, but that you bring that back to your like local church, that kind of understanding of salvation. And it doesn't go very far. And so I think that's when I probably had what now we talk about as deconstruction. I was, back then I think we said faith crisis. I'm losing my faith. Dark night of the soul was, available language at that point. Cognitive dissonance. And I don't know if you're familiar with Wendell Berry or like, there's a book called Jaber Crow, which is fiction, but Jaber is, a seminarian, young seminarian. I have the quote here. And he's talking to a mentor about these questions that he's wrestling with. And he says, and the mentor says, you have been given questions to which you cannot be given answers. You will have to live them out, perhaps a little at a time. And Jaber says, how long is that going to take? And he says, I don't know. As long as you live, perhaps. Well, that could be a long time. And his mentor says, I will tell you a further mystery. It may take longer. And so I feel now over the last 20 years, what I've been doing is just trying to live out the answer to those questions that 20-year-old Becca was wrestling with, just a little at a time, just kind of trying to figure it out as we go.
Yeah. I love that, Becca.
Yeah.
Interestingly, just as a side note, I just interviewed Trip Fuller, and that episode will probably come out, 1 week apart from this one. And he had the exact same experience of 9/11 and America's patriotic Christian response being the moment of failing to recognize, that God anymore. Yeah. So I wonder how many people have that as a pivotal moment in the perhaps something dying and maybe for some being resurrected into something different. So Becca, you've got a number of stories worth sharing and certainly some really significant experiences in your life. And a lot of that, it's sort of interwoven across time, how your body and your faith has changed through different events. One of the things you wrote about in one of the pieces of writing that that I read started reflecting on the relationship you had with your body growing up within that kind of purity culture, which I know is something that listeners of this show, many people will have their own experience of that, perhaps a little nuanced in Australia compared to the US. But can you talk about what purity culture meant for your relationship with the body that you are in?
Yeah, I fully bought into purity culture. I was in year 9 in like 1996. I was not pushed into it by my parents, which is really interesting. I remember I heard about purity rings and I wanted a purity ring. I think it's just the Enneagram 2 in me. And I remember getting my mom to buy me it from the Christian bookstore. And the one thing they gave me was a book by Josh McDowell called Why Wait? And I actually looked up the titles, Why Wait? What You Need to Know About the Teen Sexuality Crisis. So that was my sex education. So I found that on my bed one day. And so I would have read it cover to cover. And then I really dove into Joshua Harris and some other people. And I felt like purity is the way, I think because I also have an anxious attachment style, that purity was like this guaranteed way to secure God's love and to secure a good future for yourself, for your future marriage, for basically do this and good things will happen to you. Don't do this and very bad things will happen to you. But it left me really disconnected from my body, because I think to actually do purity culture well, you have to disconnect from what your body's telling you, because we have ways that our hormones and our chemicals in our body are causing us to be attracted to people and to feel things in our body, because that's actually evolutionarily what needs to happen. And purity culture makes you disconnect all of those neurotransmitters. And shame, causes shame to happen. And I just didn't learn to listen to my body. And I think the piece you're talking about, I told a story about how I was in a big youth group, we're having a prayer meeting, and I had been really sick the night before with an ear infection. And, I was just drinking like Kool-Aid, cause I felt sick. And, it was a prayer. We were in a big circle praying, and I felt like I needed to vomit. And I was like, if I get up and go to the toilet, everyone will look at me. That's how invisible I wanted my body to be. And instead I projectile vomited. The whole place had to be evacuated. I can remember this boy as he walked down the hallway, as I'm crying in the bathroom, and he's like, "Whoa, power puke." I still remember that. It was so horrible. It was so horrible. And so I'm like, wow, I can't imagine my kids doing that. My kids are such self-advocates for their body. They're constantly telling on each other, constantly, don't touch me, don't, I just didn't have that growing up the way I did. And so then fast forwarding, 20 years to where I, get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I had been, that was salvation to me, that diagnosis. That diagnosis actually probably saved my life, and getting quality professional medical attention. Because what I had tried to do for probably a decade before that was all the spiritual tools of evangelicalism and of what I sometimes call the traumatic charismatic. I'm all for charismatic expressions when they're healing and healthy. And I think sometimes that they are really healing to the body. And I think that's why charismatic stuff can be awesome. But sometimes it's very traumatic. And so I'm, dealing with mental health issues, but I'm so disconnected from my body. So I'm really focusing on my mind, on using prayer and worship, on trying to change my thinking, but mostly through shame and kind of suppression. Telling myself not to be afraid, quoting Bible verses. Or having people pray for me, and expecting that this prayer experience, which is going to be actually quite cathartic and will feel good, and I'll probably cry, which probably is good, but that actually is just it's just a little steam valve for PTSD, just letting it out briefly. So you feel good briefly, but then the trauma is still in your body, and it still just builds up again until it needs to be released. So it doesn't actually heal you. I spiritualized. I had major sleep problems. because of having PTSD, and I mean, you tell people you have sleep problems still, and it's just like, well, have you prayed through your bedroom? Have you prayed through your house? Have you, we don't talk about intergenerational trauma in the church. We talk about intergenerational curses, which is scary. That even just that phrase scares me. I really don't like it. So none of those tools were body-based. And I feel like actually the things that actually helped my body would have been called new age practices, or like medication for mental health. That's not trusting God. And I wouldn't even say this stuff was explicitly said to me, but I picked it up. It was just the world I swam in. I absorbed those messages. Nobody would have said, stop, don't go to the doctor. But nobody said, wait, tell me more about how you're feeling. Oh, this sounds to me like trauma. Even right before I went to the doctor the first time, which is basically, saying to my husband, like, this is a really sad story, and I want to acknowledge that, people that have experienced suicidal ideation like this, I'm going to mention that. But, I have a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, an amazing husband. Nothing is wrong in my life. And I said to Chris, I said, I just wish I had died. I had been in a car accident. And, this is maybe, I don't know, 14 years later, maybe like 12 years later, but that's the way that lived in my body. And even that night I wasn't even Googling trauma or PTSD. I was Googling what happens to you when you have a near-death experience. That's in 2016. That's how little trauma-informed language I even had. And so that's radically changed for me.
So, and the thing is, right, I often think, and maybe a lot of people think about the faith they grew up with as the ideas they had in their head.
Yeah.
But it's also the relationship you had to your body was a part of that, whether or not you've acknowledged that or thought about it that way. These aren't just beliefs. And if they are beliefs, they're beliefs we hold, in our arms and our legs and our chest.
Exactly. Exactly.
So you have had some very life-altering moments of, coming into close contact with the fragility of bodies and life. And one of those was, a significant car accident. Do you want to share, as much as you feel comfortable, the story of what happened there and how that, I guess, began some of this, coming into confrontation with what these ideas had been about the body and trauma and Yeah.
I mean, I think it's usually when I talk about this, I'm looking at people's faces, and I in a room, and I do always try to say that I want people that are listening to take care of themselves. That's the best thing we can do, is take care of ourselves, listen to our own body. And so I don't know how what I share will intersect with somebody else's body and their stories and their experiences. And so I want to be really mindful of that. And I think it's easier if somebody can stop listening on a podcast than actually to get up and leave a room, or, to check out and start looking at your phone. Sometimes that's harder, but I think it's really important that we actually do that. Give ourselves permission to do that. I was volunteering with a Christian organization. I was in West Africa, in Nigeria, had been there for about 3 months, and really was volunteering in a hospital, learning about supporting moms in labor. So literally experiencing the groaning of all creation that, the Apostle Paul talks about in Romans 8, but actually seeing that in the bodies and lives of these amazing, incredible women that are, bringing new life into a terrible and beautiful world, like we always are, and always have been and always will be. And I was already grieving. I'd had my heart broken by somebody that I have felt God said I was going to marry, so there's that. Thank you, Purity Culture, for that one. But just really, really loved where we were in Nigeria. Loved the living in community with Nigerians and other West Africans, and really, really fun. And literally, and I think, obviously going to West Africa or going to other places I've been, I don't know if you grew up like this, Will, but the motto was, the safest place you can be is in the center of God's will. Are you familiar with that? Like, yeah. So
I've probably heard that. Yeah.
okay. So that's really big. Like, I feel like that was really big. Like, you got to do what God calls you to do. And if you do that, the safe place you can be is God's will. It doesn't matter if you go somewhere, whatever, dangerous. And yeah, anyway, sorry, I got distracted. So literally on the way to a church service, wearing local beautiful dresses that we had made, and literally singing a worship song. And then our van, driven by one of our friends, slammed into the back of a truck. And I woke up, a couple hours later and was in a little clinic that I had just had, almost 17 people had been in the van. So I think most of us were unconscious. And this is really such a sad story. But 8 of my friends were killed that day. So these are 8 people that were like some of the most alive people that had visions and callings and plans, like really incredible people that died. And so I ended up, a few of us ended up, transported to a different hospital in a different country, another West African country. And then a couple had to stay in hospital for months. And one actually lives with a brain injury. Actually, she was a German midwife. And I'm still really close with some of the women that were on my team at that point. And my closest friend during that trip, her name was Bree. She was killed. She was American as well. We're the two Americans. And yeah, Bree was also very alive, very, full of dreams. And I just remember, I think it was particularly because she had this plan that she really felt God was leading her to for the next step, and it was like, up until then you're thinking like, oh, if God knows that you're going to die, then obviously God's not going to like speak to you plans for the future. Like this is something I kind of started to ask questions about. And then anytime something horrific like that happens, I think we are so clumsy with grief as Christians, so clumsy, and I think there's the feelings of not knowing what to say. And then there's the saying really hurtful, unhelpful things. But I think when you have a massive accident like this, where you have 8 people die, people are asking, why would this happen? Like, was there sin? Was there secret sin happening? Was this spiritual warfare? Did the enemy really just want what you guys were doing was so amazing that the enemy wanted that to stop, and so he can just kill everybody? Which that's very scary theology there. Or if we would have prayed more or at the right moment, apparently singing a song, a worship song isn't enough.Maybe, it's just like really, it's a very confusing. And when I got home, I had to have like a surgery on my hand and, have a bit of rehab. And, a couple of things. One is I went and spent time at a monastery, Benedictine monastery in Pennsylvania. And I don't know why I did that, a very Protestant person, but I just felt to. And I felt like all the Christians had been saying, I know this horrible things happen to you, but it's okay. Like, make sure you're having quiet times. Make sure you're praying. Like, here's a shovel. I know it looks like it's a desert, but just dig. There's water. Trust me. Just keep digging. And I went to this St. Emma's monastery, and the sisters were having, prayer 5 times a day. And there was literally a stream flowing through that chapel, and you knelt and you drank from it. And all I did, and we chanted the Psalms. That was very new for me. And that's when I kind of really discovered the Psalms and how much space there was for my grief, my anger, my fear, my dread, my joy, my hope. It was all there in the Psalms. And then I also really dove into, I read books like Narratives of a Vulnerable God by William Platcher. And there's a book called, I think it's like Between the Cross and Resurrection, a theology of Holy Saturday, written by, I think, Alan Lewis, and he died from cancer before he finished the book. I was really drawn to that Holy Saturday idea, that time when God is dead in the world. And I was really started to kind of, I don't know, lean into that. And I must have had people offering me, the idea that maybe God isn't in control. And I'm sure that was scary. I'm not sure who would have. Greg Boyd. I was actually exposed to Greg Boyd's stuff, which is kind of the beginnings of open and relational theology when I was a teenager. He was American Baptist at that point, so I think that's why. And so then just letting myself, and actually I had a little chapter published in a book that I have been meaning, I meant to actually plug this book, which is actually edited by Tom Ord, who's
oh wow,
yeah, and so he has a book called God Can't. So if any of this is piquing people's interest, I love God Can't.
I cannot believe that I interviewed you and Tripp one day apart.
Oh, well, we're not on the same page by any means, but yeah, Tripp, of course, that's process theology. Yeah.
There's a lot of overlap.
Yeah,
even if there may be distinctions. Yeah.
This book's called Love Does Not Control. Therapists, psychologists, and counselors explore uncontrolling love. I'm not any of those things. But somehow I got a little chapter in here called God Wants to Be Your Midwife. But I just was going to read out that I said that the notions of God as powerful hero, controller of life and death, protector of the righteous, those illustrations I had heard so many times in my evangelical upbringing completely failed me. In the following months, my broken heart was wide open to encounter God anew. First one on the scene, hands covered in our blood, weeping with those who weep, the one singing songs of hope. And I think when people had asked me, where was God when that accident happened? But essentially, why? Is this your fault? I think evangelicals, it's either you either are God's in control and I'm going to repress all my feelings of grief about this, or it was me. I did something wrong. I didn't pray enough. I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I didn't hear God. I wasn't supposed to be there, And so actually, but what the picture that kept coming to me is just I had seen a picture of the van afterwards, and I just imagined Jesus there helping to unload bodies, helping give courage to the people who were resuscitating, the people who were, helping load our bodies into their cars as they'd been on their way to church that day, and they had to take us to a bush clinic and literally donate blood so people could survive. I just found that to be where God was enough. That was enough for me. That was enough. I didn't, and I think I started to really dive into eschatology and this world is full of so much shit because of gravity and physics, because of war and colonization and greed, but God is going to make all things new. One day, Jesus is going to raise us all up from the dead, and God's going to make his home. I planted myself firmly in Revelation 21:22, in Isaiah 65, these pictures of God remaking what's actually here, no longer definitely didn't believe that anybody was going to be eternally tormented in hell, and believed actually that God was going to make God's home with us here and make all things new. So,
yeah, I'm really interested, Becca, if you're happy, just sit with that thought for a moment, because this is like a live tension in my theology is, on the one hand, you were starting to change your perception of God's sovereignty is the word people use. Yeah. Maybe God was not either orchestrating or allowing these particular incidents of horrible things. And yet there's this renewed hope in the resurrection and reconciliation of all things. And I want to have both of those, but I wonder if they are somewhat incompatible. I'm not 100% sure, but there's this part of me that leans towards that kind of vision of God as the Tom Ord God Can't makes so much sense, because what it says is that anytime somebody suffers, anytime a child dies, anytime anybody on a bus gets hit, it's not because like God would have stopped it if God could.
Yep.
And so we have to say a loving God is always doing everything God can to stop every evil thing.
Yep.
But there seems to be powers that are that are still existing alongside that. So how did you end up, or it might still be a living thing, but as you think about eschatology, end times, reconciliation, redemption, renewal, do you feel like you're able to sit with a kind of uncontrolling God and a God who can redeem and reconcile all things?
Yeah, I honestly what makes sense to me. And I think reading God Can't really gave me that final bit of permission. Like, oh, there's like theologians that actually think this way. Because a parent watching a child drown that has capacity to jump in the river and pick up the child, there's nothing in a parent, a human parent, that conceives that as loving. Nothing.
Of course not.
But we're saying that God has power, but chooses not to use it in certain situations. Like, it doesn't honor the suffering that our bodies actually experience when we say things like that. So no, I'm pretty comfortable. And for me, so what I ended up, I would even, like, our youth group at church, like, I've talked to the youth about this, is picture of God as a midwife. So as a doula, I spend time with moms who are in labor. Labor can be extremely painful, and that can be pain that sometimes even leads into full-blown suffering, and then leads into even trauma and PTSD, unfortunately. And the midwife or the doula didn't cause the pain, didn't get her into that situation, and actually the baby cannot be born without that pain of some level. There's no actual option to have a painless birth, or at least recovery even, and, but the midwife is present. The midwife is, encouraging. The midwife is so wise. Like, I don't know if it was Greg Boyd that talks about the omni wisdom of God. God knows everything there is to know, right? That can be possibly known. So I like to think of God as that midwife who's with us in our place of deep pain. We're not alone. God has so many amazing ideas when we are in tune and listening, in labor, it's like, let's try this different position. Let's try the gas. Let's hop into the shower. Let's try the bath. Is there something you're afraid of? How can I support you? And then, as that baby's being born, the midwife is right there welcoming that, but it was still the mom that does that. The mom is the one who brings the baby into the world. And yeah, so I'm pretty comfortable with that. And the thing though, that I would add is that, and though midwives cannot always bring a baby that's died back, cannot always successfully resuscitate. Sometimes babies do die. And that I would add in my, hopeful poetic moments that is the thing that Jesus will do, and I remember hearing somebody who was, he was a man and he was like in his 70s, and he was talking about the birth of his first child, and that child had died in childbirth. And this had been 40 some years ago. And he was tearing up and he said, when I meet Jesus is not going to tell me why that baby died. Jesus is going to raise that baby from the dead. And so I think I still do have a lot of hope in that future.
I feel the same.
Yeah.
And I think you've pretty much articulated what would be very similar to how I think more beautifully. I mean, the image of God as midwife is amazing. That is my new favorite metaphor for God. Yeah. And as someone who, we had the same midwife for all three of our babes, and the third time round was a home birth. And she's just one of my awesome. Biggest heroes, incredible. And when I think about God as like Helen, our midwife, I'm like, oh man, that opens up completely new doors, and it doesn't invalidate, other metaphors for God that you might find helpful, people out there. But man, add this into the ways that we conceptualize God. So I love it. Yeah. I think the only thing, and I think maybe you can't get around this, is for those of us who grew up with a faith built on certainty, which is just another element of faith that I've had to continuously release, let go of, crucify, etc. I think that it actually necessitates a certain level of even kind of end times in inverted commas, are more uncertain because it's and the trust, faith, hope, whatever word you want to use, is genuinely trust, hope, faith rather than certainty. It's like, with everything I know of God, the good midwife, with everything I've experienced, I'm still going to put my bet on the side that love can win everything. Yeah. But I can't actually say it with 100% proof or confidence or anything like that, because that's the nature of an open and relational conception of God. Yeah. So I think you can have, like, that omni wisdom is a great thought, because it's sort of like, well, if I believe love is the most powerful thing in the world, which I do on most days, then I'm going to trust that love will eventually have its way with everyone and everything. Yeah. But I can't pin it, I can't create a really closed, firm box, systematic theology, wrap it up in, I know exactly how things are going to go. Like, there's a necessary living into uncertainty in that. What do you think about that? How do you live with that?
Absolutely. But I think that my question is, like, for you, like, I'm more worried about the fruit in my life of my eschatology. So, or the fruit in my life of believing, like, even if it's like 98%, that love is the greatest power and love is going to win and Jesus is going to make all things new. Like, with the fruit in my life versus maybe the fruit of, another theology.
Well, there's this distinction I've recently heard a few people talk about. We often conceptualize hope as kind of wishful thinking. Maybe we dress it up a little nicer than that. But actually, hope is not something to just hold nice thoughts about the future. Hope is an active force, just like love. It's something to do. Hope is something to do in your life. To live in a way that says love is true and I believe love over nihilism. That's actually an active act of faith, right? To live as if love could raise things from the dead. That's going to look, that's going to look tangible if you live that way, even if you're not. It's less about future predictions and more about, what does love look like in a person? Yeah,
definitely. And I feel like for me, I recently came across a St. John of the Cross, who talked about the dark night of the soul, one of his poems from, the late 1500s. And he talks about seeing the Virgin Mary walking down the street. And I'll just read it, and I had it pulled up, but it's called If You Want. If you want, the Virgin will come walking down the road, pregnant with the Holy, and say, I need shelter for the night. Please take me inside your heart. My time is so close. Then under the roof of your soul, you will witness the sublime intimacy, the divine, the Christ, taking birth forever. As she grasps your hand for help, for each of us is the midwife of God, each of us. And it goes on. It just finishes. If you want, the Virgin will come walking down the street pregnant with light and sing. And for me, when you kind of let go of an interventionist God, you become more concerned of how is Christ being born in the world, and how am I called to come alongside people and welcome the light, welcome mercy, be with people as they grieve. You're more, it's not that I still, one of the questions you had, sent to me was like, what is your spiritual practice? For me, I feel closest to Jesus when I'm with pregnant moms in our community who are learning English or refugee background, or in addiction recovery. That's where I feel Jesus. More so than when I'm sitting in church. And so it's both letting God be my midwife, and also how can I be a midwife to how God is being born in the world? How can I take part in this stuff, trusting that this stuff is going to last into the new heavens and the new earth? This is the stuff, It's
a beautiful reframe of like discipleship as I'm learning to be a midwife alongside the divine midwife who is God. she is teaching me how to be one who stands alongside what is being birthed and, helps to support and champion and nurture that. I think that's because I still probably like every word in the Christian lexicon. I just feel like I need so many disclaimers these days. And, it's easy to think of discipleship and think of, do the things that are stereotypically associated with that rather than going into the neighborhood and be a doula and you are learning how to participate in the divine love. Yeah. So I love that, Becca. And also, just side note, I could listen to you read forever. You have a wonderful voice reading these beautiful texts.
Thank you.
I want to read a little bit of your words, actually, because I copied some quotes that I thought, were really just worth kind of bringing to people's attention. They should go and read the whole thing. But this is a lot of what you've been speaking about, but I think it's worth reading. You wrote, I am a survivor, not only of physical trauma to my body, but I am also a survivor of my own post-traumatic response. And this is where I have met Jesus again and again. Jesus hasn't rescued me from my body in exchange for a spirit. Jesus has shown me what it means to be at home in a body that bears the scars of a crucified world. Jesus is also a trauma survivor who comes to us with his own scars of body and heart and invites us to survive in him. I mean, that's just stunning. Could you share a little bit more about that and about how you now have, rather than being disconnected from your body, even with trauma and PTSD, is the place where the divine lives?
Yeah. So that, and I think in that article, I footnoted Shelley Rambo's work. So she has a book. I don't have the title, but it's about a theology of remaining. And she actually looks at, I think it's in John 17, where, Jesus is speaking to his, closest friends and followers, and he can see what the empire is going to do, right? He can anticipate that he's going to be crucified, just like so many that have gone before him. And Shelley Rambo talks about, he's anticipating that trauma for his friends. And he's saying, and so it's often translated, abide in me, abide in me, abide in my love. And she says, it's even better translated, remain in me. That's after everything is shaken away, what remains is, that's what we want to be. But then she says, but even better is survive in me, survive in my love. Oh man. Oh, I can remember exactly where I was when I read that. Cause sometimes I feel like that's all I'm going to be able to do, in light of what my body has experienced, and I say that in solidarity with so many people all over the world. You want to ever talk about church trauma, like First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are like, we should never be surprised if we experience trauma in church because the church basically created colonization. They are so it's important to never take ourselves outside of that story as well and really honor the experience of First Nations people, especially here. But sometimes I feel like I'm not going to be the world's best mom ever. Chris and I joke about being going to be mediocre parents, but we're going to be the best damn mediocre parents we can be. And once we decided that, everything was so much better.
Love it.
I'm in and out of therapy. I always am in and out of therapy. I have been on medication for years. I'm not currently, but I use a CPAP machine to sleep like an old person because of the way trauma doesn't let me sleep. And there's ways that there's things people will say, into microphones from the front of churches that are going to trigger my body. And, but when I meet Jesus, rather than meeting Jesus as the hero who arose from the grave, Jesus didn't even survive his trauma. Jesus died. God then raised Jesus from the dead. And Jesus, I love that picture of Jesus as a trauma survivor who bears these scars that are his scars and are the scars of every crucified people, who's ever existed. And I think for me, knowing that actually the trauma has been, I would never wish some of the, a couple of the things I've gone through in life. I would never wish that on anyone. And yet trauma can give you such a new way to see the world that it can be such a gift. People talk about post-traumatic growth. I like to talk about, our hearts are broken and then they heal wide open, which with room for the world. Like that's what's happened to me. I think, and when you can meet Jesus with his wounds, with his scars, with his wounds, there weren't even scars at that point, wounds. There's a place for us to notice our own, to touch our own, to be honest about our own, and I highly recommend Shelley Rambo's work around that. Yeah. I don't know how that resonates with you and your story and your experiences. And,
I mean, I feel like in lots of ways I've lived a, incredibly privileged life where, I just feel like surely something bad should happen soon.
So I know that feeling.
But I've certainly lived in the presence of many of the closest people in my life, in my family, are incredible survivors. And doing a podcast like this, leading a faith community like we do, I feel like I'm constantly surrounded by trauma and survival, resilience. And I've had my bits and pieces here and there, but largely I just feel in awe of the people I know who kind of like you're describing, Becca, like have survived in Christ somehow. And that's not about like maintaining your Christian doctrine or anything like that. But you have continued to show up to the world. That's what it means to survive in Christ. You've continued to, place your feet on the floorboards next to your bed in the morning and take the faith step of getting up again. So I think it's a beautiful picture. And I really hope that people who listen to this grab on to the image of God as midwife, because I think that's a gift if you haven't encountered that before. What are some other aspects, as you think back to your early, young purity culture, evangelical faith, to now, are there other things that you think have really shifted in the ways that you conceptualize God, spirituality, that have been really helpful, that might be helpful for other people?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is, and this is, being in charismatic, more conservative charismatic spaces is, so, and I think this is as a trauma survivor, people often say, "Oh, hey, I woke up in the night and I felt I had this bad feeling and I felt like I needed to pray for this person. And then this good thing happened to that person." Or anything where you're kind of like, people are feeling essentially anxiety and fear, and they use that to prompt prayer. I just found that so distressing, because when you actually are living with, trauma in your body or PTSD, trauma is trauma. So little things add up in our lives. And PTSD is kind of the far end of the spectrum, but there's a big spectrum of how trauma presents in our lives, unfortunately. But, so for me, I play basketball. Kara and I are on a basketball team together, and, pre-diagnosis, I'm like anxious to leave the house, anxious to drive at night, and, would feel like, oh, I need to listen to this because this is a sign. I shouldn't go. Like, this is God telling me. So that confusion between like how God speaks and anxiety in your body, and thinking, oh no, either I need to pray or I shouldn't go. And so what I actually had learned to do in therapy was tap on my forehead, literally activate my prefrontal cortex, notice my thoughts, and say to myself, Becca, you're anxious to go drive at night because of something that happened in the past, not something that happened in the future. And that was a big, big shift for me. I still have to do that sometimes. And so I think it's an interesting thing, because when you have trauma in your body, it's like, you can't just listen to your instincts. You have this, like, because your brain has been wired in this way to keep you safe, but it's a way of coming home to your body or befriending your body and saying, I acknowledge, noticing your thoughts and feelings, noticing, wow, I can tell because of the way my stomach's rumbling. Like, I can tell that you're afraid, and it's okay. I'm here with you. Like, speaking to your body. And so, I was never taught any of that in kind of growing up in the church. I was just taught you leave your feelings at the door and you worship Jesus. And that works for a while. I would have looked like a very resilient, brave person for a while until it was very obvious that I was extremely traumatized. And I think there's just fears about talking about mental illness. And that's a big thing. I like to destigmatize mental illness, destigmatize medication. And I think in churches, we need to be welcoming practices that engage our bodies. And that's why I love if you get to listen to Kara's episode, anyone who's listening, she talks about the ways that our church kind of does things differently. And we do have a contemplative service, and we often are doing practices with our bodies, to connect with God, to be grounded in our skin, at home in our skin, It's like me and my body have to be a team. We have to work together. Sometimes we get out of sync, and then we try to kind of come back together. I don't know if that
I think sense. That's also helpful.
Yeah.
Because there is, a lot of really helpful messaging around listen to your body, but it's a bit more nuanced than that, isn't it? Because it's listen to your body, and then sometimes speak back, sometimes sit in the moment, sometimes extend a hand to your body and say, it's hard, but we're going to keep walking. I love that relational approach.
Yeah.
Which again is probably a thread through the whole thing. That's my favorite thing about the open and relational theology. Everything is in these complexly, beautifully interwoven relationships, flesh and earth and divinity, and and so relate to everything as an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Becca, it's been an absolute gift to have this conversation with you. I'm aware of honoring your time, and we'll wrap it up in a moment. But what would be the final thought that you would want to leave with people who've been listening to this wonderful conversation that we've been able to have today?
Yeah, I just would want people to feel free to really acknowledge the trauma you've experienced, acknowledge how that affects your body. I think sometimes when people hear somebody with PTSD, talk, even how you kind of diminished, have had, but that it actually does, we carry that in our bodies. And Richard Rohr says, pain that's not transformed is transferred. Like, it will come out somehow. So the more we can do to really be attentive to ourselves, like, we deserve that. And if you had things come up, even just listening, like I do recommend talking to somebody who is trustworthy about that. And, always recommend therapy, whether it's even just for small amounts of time, but I think it's really been valuable. And I think playing with new images of God. The whole thing is the Bible was written by mostly men. And so there's so much imagery that as women, we haven't, and non-binary people, we haven't gotten to explore around God. And so there's a lot of work to do. And so I think let's do that together. Like, let's call God she in worship, into the microphone. Like with my kids, I always correct them. Like, if they refer to God as he, I'm like, God's spirit, you can say she, you can say they's probably most appropriate, you can say he sometimes, that's fine if that's helpful, but and I don't know if I have anything else to say, but
well, that was all wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
you for
you, Will.
opening up your story for us.
Me. It's really fun.
Oh, pleasure. I hope to come to yours and Kara's church one day in person. It sounds so great.
You should. It'll be awesome.
Awesome. All right.